Cool. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I'm super happy to introduce our group speaker, Dr. Liam McDermott, who I realized sent me a bio and I didn't pull that up, so I'm just gonna wing it.
That's nice.
Liam graduated from Iowa State University in 2020 with a Bachelor's of Science in Physics and probably some minors and stuff. Environmental studies. And then went to pursue graduate studies in physics education research at Rutgers, where they defended their thesis in 2024.
Yes.
Based on me, covering neurodivergent learning in the physics classroom. And Liam is now a postdoc and adjunct faculty at the University of Connecticut, working with Dr. Aaron Scanlon. And did I miss anything important?
No, I'm doing this stuff.
Great, well, whenever you're ready.
Sick. Cool, just double checking that people can hear me. I can't see any chats, so.
I will monitor.
But I will take the stunned silence as yes.
Here,
cool, so again, I'm Liam McDermott. I am a neurodivergent researcher researching neurodivergent students. And specifically today, I'm going to be talking about how neurodivergent folks do and learn physics in the physics classroom, and specifically like solve physics problems. This is all very preliminary research. This is the current stuff that we're working on right now in our lab, but we do have some preliminary results, so stay tuned. Well, we'll get there. There we go. Cool. So this talk, I'm going to introduce myself, the research. We're going to talk a little bit about neurodiversity, specifically break it down into the way that I think about neurodiversity as a neurodivergent scholar. And then we're going to talk about my positionality. Why is it important that I talk about myself in this research? Who am I? Why does that matter? Why does God let bad things happen to good people? Things like that. What does it mean to be a neurodivergent physicist? This is specifically stuff from my graduate, my dissertation work. And then we're going to look at our current work at UConn with our group there, some of the preliminary ideas that have been popping up from our research, and then what's upcoming and current and in the future for that work. And then actually send y'all home with stuff like what can you do in your classroom now? So, introduction. First, thank you all so much for having me. Thank you, especially Emily, for Discord messaging me randomly and saying, "Hey, do you want to? Hey, expletive. Do you want to?"
No.
I was very professional. Yes. But I also want to acknowledge and thank the amazing folks who made this research possible. In the top left, that is my current advisor, Dr. Aaron Scanlon. On the top right, that is my graduate advisor, Dr. Geraldine Cochran. And then we have two amazing undergrads right now. I used to have an undergrad at Rutgers who graduated and is no longer with the group. But Naz is not pictured. He's recently left Rutgers. But then we have George on the bottom right and Mason on the bottom left, who just got into grad school. I'm very proud of him. He's in Texas A&M now. Or he will be in Britain and then Texas A&M. It's still this school year. Anyway, so why does the research that we're talking about matter? Right now, 28.7% percent of people in the United States are disabled. 3% of them are in the STEM workforce are disabled, where 11% of STEM doctorates are disabled and 28% of STEM undergrads are disabled. So as you can see, right, 28.7% of people in the United States are disabled, and that is pretty on par, or at least matches parity with the amount of STEM undergrads that are disabled, right? That is good. We love having accurate representation. But as you can see, something's happening in undergraduate careers, right? In college, something happens where neurodivergent students stop being in STEM, or at least stop majoring in STEM, right? And so while there aren't very many statistics available for neurodivergent representation in STEM broadly, and we have to do a lot of creative math to estimate the number of those, and that is not the point of this talk, something clearly is going on, right? And so it's really, really important that we don't just focus on looking at like making sure people are entering college, right? we need to make sure that people are entering and leaving college, right? Not in the sucky way, right? We want to make sure that people are entering, succeeding, and going on to have prosperous careers in physics, chemistry, biology, etc., right? And so while the numbers suggest the STEM fields are doing very well in terms of like enrollment, the numbers also suggest that we're not doing very well in terms of inclusion, right? So disabled students, as I say here, are accessing STEM, but they're not really that supported in their education, especially as it progresses and eventually terminates, right? And so we need to make content, curricula, and careers accessible and very distinctly, purposefully supportive of disabled students, right? This needs to be a active and purposeful thing that we do, right? We need to actually create accessible STEM careers, pipelines, classes that aren't just focused on, well, you're in the door, right? What does this look like? We are clearly doing well with access, right? At least in getting people in the door. At least we're getting on parity with the rest of the disability statistics. But that is not the only like aspect of making college better, right? Or making college successful for disabled students. We also have aspects that we need to look at of inclusion and equity, right? We want to be right in the center of that. We want to have the ability to have disabled students access higher education, be included in higher education, and get out of education things on par with people who are already supported in higher education. Does that make sense? Cool. So I focus specifically on neurodiversity. And neurodiversity, very simply, right, is just the celebration of the diversity of minds. We are taking the assumption that everybody thinks, learns, behaves differently, and that is a good thing, right? We want to see people not just behaving in one way, right? We want to see people not only thinking in one way. We want to have a plethora of diversity of minds. So I like to think about neurodiversity in 3 ways. First way is neurodiversity as an identity, right? These are people who are neurodivergent. And so people generally whose brains, minds work differently than the norm, right? And by the norm, I mean this like hegemonic idea of there is a right way to be thinking, right, for someone's brains or minds to work. That is a societal thing, right? People who are neurodivergent don't fit into that bubble, right? And so as examples, right, we have autistics, dyslexics, epileptics, schizophrenics, people with ADHD, OCD, bipolar depression, Tourette syndrome. These are anyone that really falls under this neurodivergent umbrella, right? People who aren't neurodivergent are neurotypical, vocabulary. Very importantly, some neurodivergent people don't identify as disabled. Some do, right? I am neurodivergent. I also identify as disabled, right? But many people that I interviewed, right, we have a little question at the end of our demographic survey of just like, hey, do you identify as disabled? And most of them said no, right? And so while neurodiversity and neurodivergentness, right, may fall under the disability umbrella, not everybody who is neurodivergent is disabled. We also think of neurodiversity as a political idea, right? There's the neurodivergent movement. And so this is the understanding that the way that society is set up privileges folks whose brains work in neurotypical ways. Like I said, we have a societal idea. Some people don't fit in that bubble. So the neurodiversity movement pushes back on the ways that neurodivergent folks are marginalized due to neurotypical normative aspects of society, right? In my classroom, right, I am doing things in a very specific way that doesn't necessarily always align with the way that people think. That's not necessarily great, right? And so it's very important that we actively and purposefully change the ways that we think about the world and the ways that we teach, the ways that we do things to make sure that neurodivergent folks are included. That's the neurodivergent movement. And then there's a neurodiversity as an approach to research. There's neurodivergent movement, neurodiversity in general, being neurodivergent, and then there's doing neurodivergent research, right? And so this comes from Patrick Dwyer's neurodiversity approaches, and he says that neurodivergent research should, one, examine both the strengths and weaknesses that being neurodivergent in a neurotypical normative society affords, meaning that some neurodivergent folks, right, there are certain aspects of the world that maybe do not align with the way that they think, the way that their brains work, but certain things that like being neurodivergent gives them a leg up on, right? We need to analyze both of those things, not just say that like neurodivergent folks are simply only experiencing detriments, right? We also need to expand both individuals and expand research to both individuals and the context of which they live, right? Being neurodivergent or being a person is not just a like tiny bubble that you go around the world and never interact with other people or other things. We need to acknowledge that, right? We also need to treat neurodiversity as a neutral yet valuable thing. It's not good, not bad. It's simply a way of being, and that way of being is valuable by virtue of being a new thing, right? Or another thing, another piece in that puzzle, right? And then engage with and include members of the neurodivergent community at all stages of research and bring in neurodivergent theoretical perspectives. We need to be doing research about neurodivergent folks with neurodivergent folks. There's, in fact, no point in doing any of this research if we are not actively including people who this research affects, right? And then finally, we need to interrogate and work to rectify the legacy of harm that scientific research has done towards neurodivergent people. This seems pretty self-explanatory, but very much in line with the previous bullet. We need to be actively doing good, right? We should not be actively trying to harm people, or even in neutrality, acting to harm people, right? We need to be actively doing good. Questions so far? Sick. So who am I? I'm a neurodivergent researcher. I'm just looking at ADHD and OCD. To quote my psychologist, you have obsessions and compulsions and it might be a disorder. I'm also otherwise disabled. I'm hard of hearing and use accessibility devices. I have hearing aids in right now. This is my hypothesis as to why I identify as disabled, but many people that I interview don't, because I was already disabled before I, as an adult, learned these things. I'm also white and queer. And the way that I do research, right, and analyze and look at data is influenced by all of these things, right? I am looking at neurodivergent folks from a neurodivergent lens. But, right, I don't know what it's like to be epileptic, right? I don't know what it's like to have Tourette syndrome. And so there are things that I do know what it's like to be, but things that I don't necessarily know what it's like to be, right? In the same way that I do not know what it's like to be straight or black, right? And those people have very different experiences than me, white and queer. So it's very important that when we are looking at how our research affects people, that we are keeping all these things in mind and making sure that we are rectifying ways in which research has largely neglected, especially like Black neurodivergent folks, right? A lot of research treats neurodiversity as a, quote, white boy thing. It is not, it's an everybody thing. And so it's very important that we are actively working to rectify this. And please, when you are looking at the results of our research, understand that we are taking a white, queer, neurodivergent, otherwise disabled lens. In the same way that you will be analyzing the research for yourself through your own lens. So let's talk about Project Zero. This is going to be 4 different parts. Project Zero is my graduate work, so it's not my current work. And this is generally done. So my last project investigated specifically how neurodivergent folks develop a sense of identity in physics, how they come to see themselves as physicists, and we looked at it through a critical disability physics identity lens. What is the critical disability physics identity lens? I'm so glad you asked. This is the Pokeball of identity. It is the sort of culmination of my graduate career, and I hate gesturing. Hold on, there we go. So it is a culmination of my graduate career where we looked at how neurodivergent folks develop identity as a physicist, as disabled, and how these identities come together through the use of resources. And we use specifically two different frameworks to make this amalgamation of the framework, where we looked at the critical physics identity, which looks at physics identity through resources, and then the political disability identity framework, which looks at disability through a political lens. The CDPI breaks down our identity as physics-based, right? That's interest in physics, how people are seen as physicists, and how they do in physics, right? How their performance or competence aligns with the way that their brains work, right? Through resources of the things you have, material, the things you think, ideational, and the things of the people that you know, relational, right? And then we have our disability constructs of self-worth, the how you feel about yourself as a disabled person, discrimination, how you see yourself interacting with the environment through this discrimination lens, pride, how you see yourself as disabled as a good thing and in relation with other people, common cause, seeing a disability as a like what's good for you is good for me sort of situation, this sort of coming together to make the world a better place, and then political acts actually making the world a better place through taking action, right? So this is the lens that we looked at neurodivergent student identity with. So what does it look like? Well, I did a lot of data. I collected so much. I'm not going to go through it right now. But we did collect a few themes that really popped out of all of this data and a critical reading of the neurodivergent folks' interviews that we collected. So what did that look like? I have some good examples. Number one, there's this consistent idea that neurodivergent folks do physics differently. So I have a couple of different, each one of these slides will have two quotes on them. So Sky was a post-baccalaureate non-academic physicist, so someone who left undergrad, like got their physics degree, left undergrad, but didn't really go into academia, still did physics and saw themselves as a physicist, but were not really still a student, right? Sky says that of her colleagues, we all solve problems very differently. The way that we thought about things was very different. So how our brains works, it was just pretty evident. I don't think linearly. I'm very chaotic and I'm very popcorn-brained. What showed me is that what that showed me is that my way of thinking about a problem and going about solving it was not the correct way. And so that was something that definitely made me think that my brain wasn't correct. My brain is bad at doing physics. Ren, who's an undergrad, who's ADHD, bipolar depression, OCD, and post-traumatic stress disorder, stated that in comparison to my neurotypical peers, I seem slow to understand and grasp the concept that I feel like I have. I have to, because of my own efficiency's sake, I have to study longer to obtain the same results and the same level of understanding as my peers, right? There's this consistent idea that neurodivergent folks physically do physics differently. Not only do they do physics differently, they are not supported in their education. Henry, who is a post-baccalaureate non-academic physicist who has ADHD and epilepsy, stated, we are fundamentally different, right? We being neurodivergent folks, and think differently than a neurotypical person, which means that we need to be educated differently. It doesn't mean that we're stupid or we can't learn. It's just that we can't learn and truly thrive in the current state of physics education. And then Marsden, who's a grad student who has OCD and ADHD, stated, it's like other people get this metal detector that tells them where the answer that they're looking for is. And the problem is that my metal detector doesn't work. And I have to dig around a little bit before I can find what I need to find. And the exam or homework question is like, oh, here's a map. There's no X over the treasure. My neurotypical peers just have to dig to get the answer, but I have to figure out where to dig on top of all of that, right? They are not supported in their education. Again, Marsden, grad student, OCD and ADHD, states that a big part of physics problem solving, and I've had to get really good at that over the year. And so I think I have a bit of a leg up maybe over neurotypical people in that regard. Not necessarily when it comes to homework problems, but when it comes to, figuring out what the figure out why the experiment decided to break today, figuring out things that don't already have a solution and require some innovation to get there. We see a idea that thinking neurodivergently, right? Even though it's not supported, it's still a good thing, right? And it's in fact a positive way of doing physics. Ignatius, who's also a grad student who has ADHD, states that I feel like people who are more neurotypical feel more okay about not understanding every single thing that they're doing. But being neurodivergent makes me hyperfixate on every detail, which is a good thing, but it's also a bad thing because not everyone cares about it. It makes me a better scientist, but makes me a worse professional. Again, we also see, right, this idea that is not supported, even though it is a positive thing. We also see this idea that I'm better at research than classwork, right? So Elizabeth II, who's an undergrad who is autistic and has ADHD, stated that I find new things and materials that are really awesome. Like I'm a graphene person. Now I'm a graphene person, and I'm obsessed with that kind of thing. I'm obsessed with finding super niche interests that don't necessarily have answers yet, and wanting to be the one to find those answers. Whereas Ren, who's an undergrad, states that in comparison to my neurotypical peers, we've already seen this quote, right? But again, you see that even though they're worse at classwork, right? Elizabeth II states, I am better at research than this, right? I think this is the last set of quotes, but we also see this idea of this need to share a passion for physics, especially for folks who are otherwise marginalized. So Marsden, again, a quote machine, stated that I think that if a stranger were to ask me what I've done, I were to say, today I discovered a new boson, and I also taught a 7-year-old what an electron was, and they were excited about it. I think that the stranger would probably say, oh, you're really successful, and it's nice that you did that for that kid. But I think that that's not as direct as doing fundamental physics. Oh, sorry. I think that even if it's not as direct as doing fundamental physics, that sharing physics with people is, if I'm able to, help people learn about physics and get them excited about it, then that is what makes me successful. This was a very common sentiment across the interviews. And then we also see Lewis, who's a grad student. Also, very importantly, this is a very common sentiment among neurodivergent grad students in particular. And I think this is just because they're one step removed in the power dynamic, right, or one step elevated than undergrads. But we see Lewis also state that research alone by itself is nothing. It's just going to end with you. Share what you have, what you know, what you learn, your experiences, your knowledge, kind of share that with the future generations and students and scientists. And such, and just kind of share that passion with them. They say that that is the most important part of their job. So that is pretty indicative of what neurodivergent identity looks like. And so, especially this idea, like across every single interview, which is very, very hard to do in qualitative research, find something that is true for every single person. But every single person said, I do physics differently, or I do physics weird. And so that clearly there's something there, right? And so we took on this project of investigating how neurodivergent students experience undergraduate physics, which is my current project that I'm working on in UConn Avery Point. So, comes in 3 parts. The first part is a systematic literature review. The second part is conducting what's called think aloud interviews. And then the third part is collecting neurodivergent narratives. And so the systematic literature review, really we just want to know, like, are there any consistent themes from extant literature that we could draw upon? Do we need to start from scratch? Or is there something that we can already pull from when we're asking questions about neurodivergent performance and learning? And as it would turn out, very little stuff has been said. Very, very critical to this whole research, as a whole, right? We also want to call out if there's any gaps in the literature, right? We also want to see, like, how are neurodivergent students represented broadly, both demographically and in terms of neurodiversity frameworks, right? We want to see if neurodivergent folks are being looked at through this lens of celebration and neutral yet valuable ways of thinking. And also, like, are we looking at specific identity groups more often than others? And we will see, yeah, we're bad at it. Which is great. I get to fix that. So how are we doing this? first, we are framing this work with neurodiversity, critical disability theory, and feminist standpoint theory. Neurodiversity, again, we've covered that. That's the idea of celebration of diversity of minds. Critical disability theory is an understanding of disability as a systemic thing, right? This idea that a person is not necessarily disabled unless they are experiencing disabling things around them, right? And in fact, there's not like an inherent problem of a person being disabled, right? Instead, it is society saying, hey, you can't do this because XYZ, and that is the disabling thing. Does that make sense? Cool. And then feminist standpoint theory, this idea that in looking at all of this, right? I'm going to keep saying like neurodivergent learning and performance, and neurodivergent folks said that I do physics differently. There's that implicit like relative to neurotypical people, right? But much like when we teach E&M and we find that light is not like everything is relative to light, right? Very similar thing where I'm just saying that I don't really care about like what neurotypical folks have to say about their own learning because I'm not looking at that, right? I'm looking at how neurodivergent folks are thinking about their learning and what a neurotypical person has to say about a neurodivergent person isn't particularly valuable for the question that we're asking. And so our standpoint here is neurodivergent people. We're looking at literature that is done either by neurodivergent folks, about neurodivergent folks, or just simply about neurodivergent folks, right? And so we're looking at dissertations, peer-reviewed journal articles. We're looking at specifically neurodivergent STEM undergrads, and anything that has the topic of, that is about neurodivergent STEM undergrads that has the topic of neurodivergent student learning and performance. It doesn't necessarily need to have neurodiversity as the main subject. We'll see a lot of it was about disability broadly. Again, a bit of a critique about the literature that very little looked at neurodiversity specifically. But it must discuss neurodivergent learning and or performance, right? And then again, our standpoint is neurodivergent students.
Wait,
yes.
You
good?
From the standpoint
yes.
theory. So like in my head, I am not seeing the connection. Is it because you're using like the framework that feminist standpoint theory has in order
yes.
to okay.
Yeah, so we are taking the ideas of feminist standpoint theory of marginalized people are themselves creators of their own knowledge and taking that philosophy and saying that I don't care what neurotypical, there's a bunch of literature that specifically was looking at like, what do parents of neurodivergent folks have to say about their students' learnings? That's not something I particularly care about.
Got it.
Yeah, thank you. So this is the general map of our systematic literature review. The initial literature corpus was 2,362 papers and an additional 107 from specific journals that may or may not have just popped up out of our ProQuest. Thank goodness for our undergrads, especially George, who managed to whittle that down to 275 in like 2 weeks. He is very good at his job. And then we whittled down that further to 12. But from that 275, we did a forwards and backwards search because maybe we didn't necessarily catch everything. We arrived at our total literature corpus of 47. That's still a lot of papers. What does the quantitative data look like of our literature review? We see a lot of the papers looked at college students broadly and STEM broadly. Very few of the papers looked at specifically disciplines. Very few looked at life science or biology. Physics is doing pretty well. I would like to point out that 2 of those papers of the 4 were me. So maybe not doing as well as we'd hope. But mathematics and engineering, like the hard sciences appear to be doing hard sciences, quote unquote, but appear to be doing well, at least better than most. We also see a very heavy representation of what I'm going to call the big 3 for neurodivergent research, which is ADHD, autism, and dyslexia. These are just consistently the most represented in higher education literature and neurodiversity research in general. My hypothesis, especially for education-based, is that these are the 3 that really are the most visible in an education environment, specifically ADHD, autism, and dyslexia. And then autism and ADHD are really like the poster children of neurodiversity and neurodivergent ness, right? And as you can see, 4 papers looked at neurodiversity in general, like took a neurodiversity framework to their data collection. Again, 2 of them were me, so you know. So what's this literature looking like, right? What is the preliminary qualitative results? Specifically, we see multitasking learning being detrimental to student info retention. We see that there's a constant switching of focus that is not useful when you're looking at both note-taking and listening and absorbing new information. We see that there's a call for and a need for multisensory representation, not just multiple representations. There's a thing in universal design literature, which is like the idea that we should be creating classrooms that are universally accessible, right? There's this idea of and a call for multiple representations. It's very important that those multiple representations aren't just like, I wrote the math here and I wrote the math over there, right? It should be multiple, like multi-sensory. We should be like having students like get up and move around and also show them visually, and also have an auditory aspect to it, and also a doing aspect, right? We also see a lot of nonlinear problem solving. There are many different ways of solving problems that appear like out of the literature, like going around the problem, having thoughts to like take multiple paths at once, doing like pattern recognition, or like communication and writing differences. We also see something that I'm calling the camera effect, this idea that neurodivergent folks constantly feel like they're being watched or perceived at all times. We also see avoidance tendencies, this idea of like having a like fuzzy brain, fuzzy thoughts, right? This like blurriness of thoughts, and general feelings of pain as it relates to doing classwork, right? Or expectations of class. Specifically, this idea of like work itself is Sisyphean, right? That there is this, you're putting in so much work and effort just to start a problem and get to the end and turn it in on Friday, only to do it again on Monday, right? We also see time anxiety, brain fog, memory-related anxiety, and this idea that rest does not necessarily equal recharge, right? That weekend of, yes, I turned in my work on Friday, I get to rest, but I do not necessarily get to recharge and then start again, right? It is just constantly shoving that rock uphill, again and again and again, right? We see effect of neuroqueer time or slowness. This comes from queer time, this idea that like queer folks experience time differently than like cisgendered or straight folks, right? Non-queer folks. That idea of like, to give a example of queer time, right? The idea of like a first kiss happening in as teenage years doesn't necessarily always exist for queer folks, right? That's not necessarily the case here, right? This is this idea that like work is Sisyphean, or it takes a different amount of time to absorb information, right? There's clearly a difference in time. And then different modes of thinking. Some folks think in 2D, 3D, some folks think only in words. I only think in words. Some people have pop-up thoughts that like while they're working, they're like, oh, maybe I could work on this other thing, right? So we see symbol mix-ups, needing structured categories to process information, right? And so all of this, right, we've isolated them down into 4 key themes. And very nicely, we see 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension. So it's reflective of reality. So the spatial dimensions, of course, this is just an analogy here, but our 3 spatial dimensions are the spatial aspects of class, right? So these are the educational structure, the social structure, and then the cognitive structure, right? And then we have our time aspect. Really, we looked at all this and we said, like, okay, like these are true, right? Like we see these reflected, these spatial dimensions, but there are things inside of them that are pervasive across all three spatial dimensions that it needs its own thing, but it's not like related necessarily to the educational structure, right? And so we needed a like new sort of pop out theme that didn't quite fit with those three, and we realized what they had all in common was time. This idea that like we have slowness, we have differences in how work gets done, things like that. And so we're borrowing from queer time, but we see this temporal aspect of being neurodivergent pervasive across the three different spatial dimensions or the dimensions of the class, right? So what does it look like? Et voila. We see our neuroqueer time being in all three, or at least affecting all three spatial dimensions. But we have our educational structure, such as like the sensory needs of a person in class, the shifting tension between tasks, this like idea of like tedium being a very critical component of the class, a need for methodology-oriented teaching, and looking across like digital learning environments, that digital learning environments are good, but not necessarily like they can't replace in-person learning environments. We see social aspects and asocial aspects of learning. The camera effect, this idea that you're always being perceived. Missing class is not necessarily uncaring about the class. Sometimes you just need to rest to recharge, right? Cheating as a last resort. There's multiple papers that are like, with this like Sisyphean work of I'm putting in all this work on Friday, or to get to Friday, only to do it all again, and I'm seeing all my colleagues put in way less work and get far more reward. And so it seems like the last resort is to just cheat so that you can at least get that grade, right? That's like structural to how we assign value to class. We also see students benefiting from a research setting and this permission burden, that there's a burden placed on students to ask permission to succeed in class, right? To get accommodations, to get access to the class. And then for cognition and learning aspects of class, we got our nonlinear thinking, we got our differences in thought processes, we got our process-oriented learning, this being like, I want to learn in a, how do I solve problems, right? How do I get from A to B? As opposed to saying there is A, there is B, connect them, right? Some students need to be taught how to connect them, right? And then like very heavy focus on needing pattern recognition and being that being a beneficial thing, but still taking a bit more time to organize those patterns. And then like issues with symbol distinguishing, right? This is especially prevalent in dyslexic literature, that folks who are dyslexic do not have issues, but do struggle with distinguishing different symbols, especially like T's and like not T's and plus signs, but like T for time versus T for tension still is a bit rough, right? Even for non-dyslexics. So that is our literature review. Part 2. Our Think Aloud interviews, we are still currently conducting them. We've done our first like round of Think Aloud interviews. And by first round, I mean I'm teaching a class right now, and so I don't have much scheduling time. This will pick back up in the summer. But really what we're doing is having students solve a series of introductory physics problems and walking us through the thought processes. So here are some indicative problems of this interview process, right? We have our gravity train problem. Notice that the gravity train problem doesn't have all the information that you need to solve, right? That is a very critical part of this interview protocol, because we do want to see what happens when neurodivergent students have to look something up, or like, do they are they going to ask permission to look things up? Are they going to like what does not having all the information look like in a problem-solving setting, right? And then we have like show when light reflects from two mirrors that meet each other at a right angle, has the outgoing ray, or show that the outgoing ray is parallel to the incoming ray as illustrated in the following figure. We've given students literally everything, right? We have our A, we have our answer, right? That the incoming outgoing rays are going to be parallel, but we want to see how they're going to solve it using a proof, right? And very interestingly, I have not had a single duplicate answer for number 7 yet. Everyone solves it differently. It's really, really cool. So far, 7 participants have been interviewed. We have 18 more to go. So far, 2 Hispanic and 5 white folks, and 5 women, 1 man, and 1 non-binary person has been interviewed. By the end, we're going to have 75 hours of data to transcribe and code. 75 hours of data, multiplied that by 3, because that's how long it takes to transcribe things. We have 225 hours of transcription work. So we're hiring 2 undergrads for that. That is too much for 1 person. We did a pilot study. I don't know why they made this guy very skinny, but we interviewed a senior undergrad with ADHD. We're going to call him Joe. And so while Joe is solving the problems, we see, so 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 4 is, let's just assume it's 40. Square root of 40, let's split that into 22, that's 5 and 4, and let's leave it at the square root of 40, just for simplicity. So he introduces a positive velocity. On one of them, there's going to throw off where it's going, so I'm going to be fighting against gravity, or it's going to be fighting against gravity is close to just fighting against only gravity. It'll be just under gravity, if that makes sense. So Bob's ball just drops, and then Alice's will have a initial velocity, and it'll go up and come back down in a parabolic shape, right? This is what we've used as indicative quotes of what our undergrad Mason has called chaos thought. There is this idea across literature of neurodivergent folks having this like firework thought, this popcorn brain thing, right? This idea of thinking from A to B very non-linearly and going, okay, cool, I'm going to start solving the problem, and it's going to be very just like attacking the problem as quickly as possible, but hello, there we go. Constantly like reiterating the thought process over and over and over again, and evaluating the thought process over and over and over again as the problem gets solved. There we go. So one really, really cool thing, I appreciate you so much. One really, really cool thing is that when we take Bloom's taxonomy is just this concept that there are certain like ranks to thinking, right? That students will, on a very low level, try to remember things, then try to understand things, all the way up to the highest level of thinking, which is creation and evaluating your own thought process, right? And so we see here, right? In fact, there's a clear point in which Joe says something that we call a phenomenological primitive, which is like a thing that is wrong, but it's in fact a thing that we try to correct in class, which is that when you toss a ball up, it is fighting against gravity. In fact, gravity is always present. In fact, it has to beat gravity is the thought. But in fact, gravity is always present. It's just the velocity goes down to 0 and then becomes negative, right? We see Joe start with that and then immediately correct it, right? And so while it looks like he's just applying formulas or applying these phenomenological primitives, right? He is in fact like evaluating his own thoughts, analyzing these thoughts and analyzing the problem in real time, right? And so if he just stopped right there, well, you'd assume that Joe doesn't know anything, right? But Joe is very, very good at solving these problems. It's just he's doing it all at once on top of itself, right? And so we call this chaotic thought. The iteratively simplifying, revising, and evaluating every single thought while the thought is still baking. So some preliminary thoughts from our Think Aloud interviews. Though we've only interviewed 7 folks so far, there are some pretty common through lines. specifically taking this iterative generative approach. So going around the problem, this idea that you have to try every single possible path before you get your A to B through line. Firework thought, this idea you have one thought and then it becomes 20 more thoughts, and then those thoughts become 20 more thoughts. And then proprioceptive problem solving. A lot of folks that I've interviewed have been like, okay, well, I'm the electron and the electron is moving. And that's really, really cool because it's like feeling like what the physics is doing in your like own body. And so this calls into mind something that's in developmental psychology is proprioception, this like calibration of the internal GPS. So we're calling it, for right now, proprioceptive problem solving. What else? Some other less problem solving things have popped up, such as the brain moving faster than your mouth, feelings of being tricked by problems that if you're solving a physics problem, there has to be some trick. Not trusting your memory, even for first principles. Many times there's one problem that we have that's get kinetic energy in terms of momentum, and multiple students have been like, can I just look up the equation for energy, right, for kinetic energy, which we think is a first principle thing, but they're like, no, I just do not trust my memory right now, especially in this like stressful environment. We see this belief that there's a correct assumption to make rather than taking assumptions and moving on from that. And so while not problem solving, still very important to problem solving. And so then finally, we have our third project, which is that we're collecting the narratives of neurodivergent physics students. Again, we've actually conducted 7 now, but we have not analyzed any of them. So I don't have much to report here, but that it exists. So what can I send you home with? Specifically, I'm going to break this down into our 3 spatial themes from earlier that in terms of cognition and learning, right, we need to be taking this multisensory representation approach to teaching students. We also need to scaffold our lessons. We need to consistently call back to the original topic at hand and be like, see how this relates to the broader topic. We need to be taking both a top-down and bottom-up approach, going, here's the topic, here's how everything relates to the topic, and building up the topic from first principles. We need to be teaching problem-solving methodology, right? We need to teach students how to get from A to B, and then we need to make the hidden curriculum explicit. Not all students know like the things that we expect them to know, right? As in like certain aspects of calculus, they might have been like gone that day, right? This is not necessarily even a neurodivergent thing. So we need to make the hidden curriculum that we are expecting students to learn very explicit. In terms of sociality and asociality, we need to make both group and individual assignments, create flexible attendance policies, say explicitly at the beginning of class that you're open to implementing accommodations to lower that permission burden. We need to encourage and or create research-based learning environments, encourage students to work in the lab, and take focus breaks about once per hour. One of the common things that a lot of students seem to not be able to focus for the full hour, so take a break, 5 minutes, or at least like check in, you know? And then for educational structure, we create our lowest stakes assessment or required self-assessment, a way to mitigate the like stress on getting a good grade. Create flexible and inflexible assignments. This is a thing that popped out of my grad school, but this specifically, like, here's the due date. You can miss the due date if you like need, but there is a due date if you want to succeed in the class. Use accessible fonts, and then record your lectures and provide materials in advance. So yeah, one last thought. I've gone a little bit over time, but very important quote from my dissertation, that the violence that neurodivergent students face in physics does not come from hypothetical bad or evil ableist professors, but those who accept and uphold ableist norms in education. It is critical that we are being actively supportive. We are purposefully creating inclusive environments for students, not just saying, well, I'm not bad and evil, I'm not ableist. So clearly I'm doing fine, right? We need to be actively making sure that students, right, don't have this permission burden. Yeah, thank you. This work is funded by NVS and LGBT Tech, and these are my group and my cats.
Thank you, Liam. Don't mind me coming over here so I'm closer to the mic.
You.
Thanks. So we have time for some questions. And if you're on Zoom, feel free to put them in the chat and I will read them. And for questions in the room, if Liam, if you wouldn't remind like repeating them briefly for folks on Zoom.
Have no fear, I'm hard of hearing.
Yes,
I do that anyway.
I'm well aware. Yes, so opening the floor to questions. Claire's right here first.
Okay, so it's my first time hearing about critical disability
Hell yeah.
theory. And so I guess as someone who has who is neurodivergent, so I have like mental illnesses, whatever. So I understand part of this, like if I take like a simple example where it's like, oh, someone is in a wheelchair, we commonly consider that as having a disability, but if everything was wheelchair accessible, they would no longer be considered, it wouldn't be a disability.
Yes.
But there's something about.
But they'd still be in the wheelchair.
Yeah, there's something about when that, especially looking at it from like a mental health standpoint, no matter how much access I'm given or how much society welcomes, whatever, there will always be distress caused by this thing, and I will always consider that disabling. So I feel like part of it, like, I feel like it can't really be like, everyone would be fine if society was better. Like, I feel like a lot of it is up to the individual and what the individual wants and wishes they could do, no matter what society says.
Yes.
You know?
So paraphrasing for the audience, critical disability theory, right? It's this idea that like societally, you have these disabling things and disability is not intrinsic to the person, but being neurodivergent, right, you feel that there are still some intrinsic things about being neurodivergent that wouldn't go away even if the world was perfectly created to accommodate, right?
Mhm.
Cool. Yes, correct, 100%. And in fact, so while we're using critical disability theory for our literature review, because we're taking the systems level approach, right? Really, we take a neurodiversity or a diversity framework to disability as a whole, right? Where, in fact, part of the neurodiversity approach to research is looking at neurodiversity as not just like if I made everything perfect and wonderful and accommodating, you still be neurodivergent, right? And saying that instead of being a purely socio-political thing, is a socio-political interaction between person and environment, and person and person, and environment and person, right? So yes, is the short answer to your question. Yes, you're 100% correct, and that is actually the approach we use. Just for the literature review, we're taking the systems level approach, and so we're not going that deep into it.
And I guess as a researcher, you can only affect the societal.
Correct.
You can never, affect the internal aspect of it.
Yes.
So
In fact, that's part of the to acknowledge the harms that research has done, right? Wherever it may be. Oh well. But yeah, the acknowledgement of harms, right? That we want to rectify harms and say that neurodivergent folks shouldn't just be like cured, right? That's eugenics and not good. I hope that I'm not. I hope I'm not in a room of folks that would disagree on me on that. But yes. Yeah, I saw you second. I'll do that. Then you. Sick.
Okay. So you were giving suggestions on what like classrooms should do.
Yes.
What do you think are like some good strategies to do when people's like accommodations might conflict with one another?
Yes.
For example, like if someone like needs a lot of different modes of like learning a material, but someone would get like overwhelmed.
Yeah. So this is just like a thing about disability studies that not everyone's accommodations are not affable, are in agreement with everybody else's accommodations, right? In fact, like internally, right, I have some accommodations that are very sensory focused, but also I'm hard of hearing, right? So I do need people to be louder, but I also hate it when people are louder. What you do with that, right, is you have this, like, accommodations especially are a negotiation, right? Teaching itself is a negotiation between student and instructor, where like, let's say that you have a student who really needs, like, really is a chaotic environment, and a student who really needs, like, very low sensory, very, like, orderly environment. First, like, if you're in a lab, right, very quote unquote easy to do aspects is separating and not having those two students work together, right? Because that's a disastrous match, right? But I would also recommend that folks look at Daryl McPadden, my advisor, Aaron Scanlon, I think Jackie Cheney's work on how to mitigate or like mitigating harms. I will send it to Emily so you can send it out. But specifically, they look at awkward time. So least or like actively supportive, not supportive, right? What different aspects of the classroom can you make actively supportive versus not supportive, right? And how do you make your class supportive for everybody by sort of having this compromise between folks? Does that make sense? So in short, very individualized approaches to like making sure that folks have their access that they need, right? While also like having certain compromises and certain negotiations between folks and as instructor being like, okay, cool, maybe I need to have like individual time with this one student because they need this extra non-sensory hour, right? Which is more time on me, the instructor, but also my job, right? So yes, does that answer your question? Also, to reiterate the question because I didn't do it. How do we rectify students who have conflicting accommodation needs? And then also, yes.
Real quick, it is 3:30, so if you are going to physics club, it is okay to go to that. We can, I think, still for folks want to stay, we have another question in the
Yes.
group and then one on Zoom as well.
Although we take it. Or not.
So on Zoom, do you have any thoughts on making the undergrad grad admissions process more inclusive? Ooh, no. That's just not my research, right? But one of the big things that other people have said, right? Getting rid of the GRE, right? Or GRE requirements, getting rid of the qualifier, getting rid of which I know is like big sinful thing to say, but getting rid of the GRE because not everybody tests well, right? Getting rid of the requirement of like GPA requirements, right? I personally, right, when I'm looking at, we just had to hire some folks. I didn't really even look at people's GPAs, right? I looked at how people are going to interact with the research group that we're in right now, right? And so really taking that much more holistic approach to make the process more inclusive while getting rid of the, like on paper, getting rid of the like hard markers, right? The like GPA marker, the GRE marker, all those things. In getting rid of those, you end up taking a more holistic approach and making the process more inclusive. Yes. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry if you had to go to physics club and you're not here anymore. Sick. Yes.
Yeah. I forget where I saw the statistic, but I saw somewhere that like graduate students across all fields are like
Yes.
3-4 times more likely to check off all of the symptoms for clinical depression.
Yes.
And then when I like told this to a professor, They were like, well, that's not surprising. And I was like, what do you mean? How is that not surprising?
Like, definitely not surprising, but
Well, I think that STEM and academia in itself just attracts neurodivergent people.
yes.
And like, why? Why
Yeah.
is that? Why do we gravitate? towards it?
So at a risk of sounding bio-essentialist, but oh, sorry, yes, thank you. So the question is, talking to a professor and quoting the statistic that more STEM grad students are more likely to check off all the boxes of clinical depression. And a professor said that, oh yeah, STEM attracts folks who may be neurodivergent. Why is that? So I have a couple of like hypotheses, right? Which is, take my word with a grain of salt. My word is not gospel. But one thing, right? A lot of neurodivergent folks are, like, we see in a lot of literature, this like pattern recognition focus, right? And STEM is all about like connecting patterns, right? That's why you also see most likely a lot of students in like history, right? That are neurodivergent students in history, because it's all about pattern recognition. And that just makes your brain light up, right? So there's that. There's the like high achieving neurodivergent folks, right, getting put into like the talented and gifted program, which is another form of neurodivergence, right? Being put into those programs and being sort of not pushed, but subtly recommended and not so subtly recommended to pursue STEM and engineering careers, right? And also just the general societal, like, STEM is good. And therefore you are good if you do STEM, you know? So I think that we've created an environment that privileges, or at least attracts, certain aspects of neurodiversity, even though we have created also a system that, once inside, really disenfranchises those students. Is that okay?
Statistic, is it symptoms of depression before or after?
Across, not even just them.
That might be
Like-
a symptom of
yeah, of grad school.
rather than
Yeah.
attracting.
Yeah,
But I do know what you mean though.
Which
Yeah.
is why I was like, how is that not surprising? He was like, oh, this
He's
is
like,
just
have
the
you
way
been to any
academia.
of my classes?
It's just like,
Yeah.
it's just how academia just like tends to get those people in. How it's
Yeah.
just
Make
so
them
fun.
worse.
I mean, like, you showed all the, I've never been diagnosed as being neurodivergent, but like a lot of the things that you showed are got different ways of thinking. I am all of those things practically.
Oh, I'm very convinced that my work is not that the work that looking at statistics is very underrepresented.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
No, I was curious, like, what do you, like, when people collect data, about like the prevalence of neurodivergence?
Yes.
Undergrad and grad school, I feel like something that I anecdotally have noticed is compared to being in public high school, like, yes, I meet more neurodivergent people in college, however, the types of neurodivergency they have has like become less diverse.
Yes.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, thank you. So the question was, while seeing more neurodivergent folks, like while we're seeing more neurodivergent folks in college, right? And very anecdotally, but seeing more neurodivergent folks as compared to like the public high school, the diversity of neurodivergent folks seems to have decreased. I'm presuming there's a why is that after that. Like a why is that? So I have certain suspicions that go back to the big three, right? My description of why.
Isn't it diversity
Yeah.
Of all things, or the diversity of the type of neurodivergent?
The diversity of the type of.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think that because some of that comes down to, right, we see these big three of ADHD, autism, and dyslexia. Take, for instance, right, the full neurodiversity umbrella, right? That there are certain identities under the neurodiversity umbrella that are not as supported, right? Or are not as stereotyped or what's the word? Are not as pushed into college as like folks who are ADHD, autism, dyslexia. That you end up seeing sort of a like kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that folks who are autistic and ADHD show certain signs that we as a society say are the good at STEM signs, right? Of pattern recognition, of this like diversity of thought, but being really good at research, being or again at risk of being bioessentialist. But and so I think that the sieve just is catching autistic, ADHD, and dyslexic folks more than, like, say for instance, like I had a lot of folks who had bipolar depression in my dissertation study, but they were very distinct, like this is the condition that is like that like the classroom is making a barrier, right? Because they're not going to class as often because they're simply just too tired and collapsing, right? So I think that the Civ is doing a better job at autistics and ADHD and dyslexic students, and so that therein lies a bit of a stronger issue that we're not catching everybody else. But yeah, that's kind of a garden path sentence, but
I'm gonna,
yes.
sorry, wrap up real quick. We can, if Liam is fine, keep asking questions after, but real quick, to quote Greg McDermott, that's my boy, great lecture.